Daniel Ellsberg, ex-Pentagon employee, made history by leaking to the New York Times the Pentagon Papers, a top-secret study of Vietnam policy. Efforts to stop publication lost in the Supreme Court, and everybody got in the act. Ellsberg still faces prosecution.
The United States had been involved in Indochina long before President Johnson deployed troops in 1965, and the Vietnam War was not the first time that the West intervened in the area. In fact, Vietnam had been a French colony since the late 1800s, and only gained independence following 9 years of guerrilla warfare led by Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth League, which would morph into the Viet Minh. Finally, at the Geneva Conference in 1954, the French were given 2 years to erase their Indo-Chinese presence. Like other anti-imperials, Ho Chi Minh and his followers embraced communism as a means to separate from the West and create equality. But despite Vietnam's opposition to the Chinese, the United States saw them as a threat which could foil their policy of containment. As the French were removed, the United States seemed eager to take their place. In 1954, the United States assisted Ngo Dinh Diem, an anti-communist, to take power in southern Vietnam. In this way, the United States virtually created the country of South Vietnam and installed Diem as its dictator. To the Vietnamese, the United States had taken the place of the French. Opposition from Vietnamese nationalists sparked the beginning of the Vietnam War in 1960, but despite U.S. involvement from the beginning, they only officially joined the war in 1965. Meanwhile, a top-secret study was being written by members of the Johnson administration, which would later be known as the Pentagon Papers.
It was the evening of October 1st, 1969, when I first smuggled several hundred pages of top-secret documents out of my safe at the Rand Corporation.
Daniel Ellsberg, the famous whistleblower, leaked the top-secret Pentagon Papers to the New York Times in 1971. But Ellsberg was not always the anti-war fanatic which he would become. As a young man, Ellsberg was employed at the Pentagon, where he was part of the generation of whiz kids who helped the United States military on their war effort. He was a strong believer in America's concern regarding the spread of communism throughout Asia. Ellsberg, along with many other government officials, was involved in keeping many secrets regarding military actions, including why the war actually began. But after insisting on joining the front line in Vietnam, his entire outlook changed. He realized that although the government submitted positive, optimistic reports on the Vietnam War's progress, the war had in fact transformed into a stalemate in which the United States had no hope of winning.
I was beginning to realize we couldn't beat this enemy in their own backyard. We were not going to win.
The Vietnam Study Task Force was created by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara on June 17, 1967, for the purpose of writing an encyclopedic history of the Vietnam War. The study showed the development of U.S. involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967. President Lyndon Johnson and Secretary of State Dean Rusk were not informed of the creation of this study. It was comprised of over 7,000 pages of government secrets and cover-ups. The study comprised 3,000 pages of historical analysis and 4,000 pages of original government documents in 47 volumes and was classified as top secret. The group was comprised of 36 military personnel, historians, and defense analysts from the Rand Corporation and the Washington Institute for Defense Analysis. The study conclusively shows that each U.S. administration from Harry S. Truman through Lyndon B. Johnson had knowingly and systematically deceived the American people over the U.S.'s involvement and interventions in Southeast Asia.
In October of 1969, Ellsberg and his co-worker Anthony Russo began photocopying the documents at Rand Corporation. In February of 1971, Ellsberg showed the study to Neil Sheehan, a New York Times reporter. Ellsberg released 43 out of the 47 volumes to Sheehan. On June 13, 1971, excerpts of the study were published in the New York Times. The first article about the study was called Vietnam Archive. Pentagon Study Traces 3 Decades of Growing U.S. Involvement. Historian John Prados renamed the document the Pentagon Papers. In one day, 30 years of governmental secrets were released to the world. In 1971, U.S. Senator Mike Gravel released the remaining pieces of the Pentagon Papers to the press. He had very similar views to Daniel Ellsberg.
Do it next week, I could do it the week after. And I could maybe just hang on to the documents and never do anything about it and just sit by and let time go on. But the thing that I'm overpowered with, totally overpowered with, is the fact that this very moment we're killing people in Vietnam without...
The United States government and the Nixon administration feared that the publication of the Pentagon Papers would discredit them by revealing years of lies to the American people and the United States Congress. They were determined to stop the press from publishing it, so they sued the New York Times Company in New York's District Court on the grounds that they stopped the publication to maintain national security. After a Times victory, the case was brought to the Supreme Court. Here, practically an identical case occurred. The United States argued again that the Pentagon Papers being open to the public posed a national security threat. The New York Times attorneys Floyd Abrams, William McGarty, Alexander Bickel, and Lawrence McKay easily rebutted this in 3 ways. 1. That judging by the slowness of the government's response, there was no true security threat. 2. Any secret codes mentioned in the documents would have been changed long ago because it was the Army's policy to change codes often. And 3. None of the lower courts found anything in the Pentagon Papers which they thought could pose a security threat. The Times' main argument was that they had the constitutional right of freedom of the press. The government is only allowed to censor media in time of war, and the government had never officially declared war.
Next, the U.S. argued that in order to preserve the integrity of Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, it was necessary to censor the paper's publication of the Pentagon Papers. But this was not sufficient legal grounds for censoring the media. The United States' final argument was that the documents were stolen and were only the property of the government. In the end, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the New York Times in a 6-3 split decision on grounds of their First Amendment rights based on the freedom of the press.
Because we have an Espionage Act which was adopted basically in 1917 and which is extremely hard to sort of parse in terms of knowing answers to what's allowed and what's not allowed. I'd put my answer this way. I think there's a strong argument that newspapers are free to and not at great risk in revealing the information provided them by a source.
Now, Grossberg, you have a concern about the possibility of going to prison for this?
We have a quick back. Wouldn't you go to prison to tell some this war?
Ellsberg was aware that he could be charged with a life sentence in prison under the Espionage Act for leaking top-secret government documents. But because of his contact with anti-war advocates, he believed that breaking laws was justified if he was doing the right thing. He leaked the Pentagon Papers with expectations that it would immediately end the Vietnam War. Although this was not the case, it did hasten the Americans' withdrawal from the area, because it set in motion a series of events which would lead to the fall of President Nixon, and it strengthened the anti-war movement, which was already strong at the time. But the largest impact of the leakage of the Pentagon Papers was something Ellsberg did not expect. The papers became more than proof that 3 presidential administrations lied to the people and to the Congress about their actions in Indochina. As the government attempted to stop the New York Times from publishing the papers, the issue became one of freedom of the press.